SoundCartel.
Do you trust what you hear from the podcast you listen to? And how can brands build more trust with their listeners through podcasts? Well, Nic Newman has the answers. He's the lead author of the Reuters Digital News Report, which examines annually the global impact of technology and digital media on trust. And trust us, this is a fascinating episode.
Many of them are doing it by trying to build on those trusted elements, the intimacy, having hosts that build relationships over time. And, it's very different from trying to sell something. It's about trying to build a relationship. And off the back of the trust that you build with the relationship, then you can do other things. But the problem is that many commercial organizations and brands want a quick fix. And podcasting is about building for the long term.
I'm Nic Schildberger, Managing Director of audio agency SoundCartel. And this is Podcasting Essentials. Welcome to episode 11 of season 5. And joining me is producer and co-host Nicole Goodman.
Hey Nick, great to be back.
In this episode, we're talking all things trust.
We are. And look, we know that podcasting already has an enviable position over many other forms of media when it comes to trustworthiness.
Yes, and even ads in podcasts have higher levels of trust and perform better than ads in other media because of that general reputation that podcasting has been able to build in recent years. But don't take it all from us. We've got an expert in this field who has huge amounts of international evidence to back it up.
We sure do, and that is Nic Newman. He's a senior research associate at Reuters International for the study of journalism at Oxford University. And he's the lead author of the annual Digital News Report, which is the most comprehensive annual global study of news and media consumption covering 46 countries.
Wow.
Yeah. Nic was also head of product at the BBC. He keeps a very close eye on audio developments and has written a couple of definitive reports on podcasting, the links of which are in the show notes. Welcome, Nic Newman, to Podcasting Essentials.
Hi, Nic. Great to have you on the show.
Great to be here.
Nic, tell us a little bit about your background and why you believe that the impact of technology on news is so important.
Well, my background actually was in radio. So it's a reporter, producer, editor at the BBC World Service. I've always been absolutely fascinated in the power of audio, the craft of using sound, telling stories. I've also been interested in technology as well. And that sort of really, I guess, came together when the internet arrived. And I started thinking about that. And originally, I did a series of programs for the BBC World Service called the World Service Guide to the Information Superhighway. And this was just after Al Gore had popularized the term. And that really got me sort of engaged with the potential of the internet. And so I then lobbied within the BBC to help start a news website, which we did in 1997. And then that started as a little side project. And now, of course, that is the dominant way in which people access news. Mm-hmm. So that sort of transition's been incredible. But also, something we didn't really envisage at the time, actually becoming the main way in which people listen to radio and to audio. So it's kind of oddly come full circle.
Now, the Reuters Digital News Report examines data from 46 countries, and some of the information is so granular in what it tracks. How do you achieve such a vast and deep dive?
Well, we started this sort of 10 years ago, and it's now the world's largest ongoing survey of news. It's based on an online poll, so we poll 2,000 people in each country. That in total, that's about 100,000 people. Representative samples, so Australia being one of the countries, and then we sort of can link all kinds of other data we have around demographics and voting behavior and all sorts of other variables to sort of really understand what's going on under the hood and how things are changing and how different groups are consuming news in different ways. And I think what's unique about it is that sort of comparison between countries on the one hand and between regions, but also that you can see trends over time. So, for example, you can see one of the questions we ask is, do you prefer to watch news or listen to news or read news? And, that doesn't change very much year on year. But what's interesting is when you look at how young people really engage with podcasting, for example, and are really interested in listening to stuff, this is kind of really interesting seeing how those things change over time with different cohorts.
Well, tracking trust in media is fascinating. And we know that about 60% of people trust podcasts over traditional media. Even ads in podcasts have higher consideration. But from your research, what lessons are there for non-news brands about building trust with listeners within the podcast format?
Yeah, trust is an interesting and complicated one. I think some of it just sort of is inherited trust from radio. So, historic research will tell you radio was always the most trusted medium. That's partly because, you have a relationship with hosts, for example, but it's also because television sort of was seen as distorting things because of the pictures or the upstart medium. But I also think it's because podcasts, it's been a much less commercialized space. Apple Podcasts was always free. And even when ads appeared, the ad density was much less than with traditional radio. It's not been polluted by algorithms in the same way as much of digital media has. People still find it in a very traditional way through sort of personal recommendations. And then in terms of the content, I think it very much depends where it comes from and the standards and who's producing the content. So actually trust in particular bits of content is very variable. I think the commercialization of podcasting is happening pretty rapidly. And so, podcast is changing, attitudes to podcasting, the audience is changing. It started off with this very geeky audience that knew how to use RSS feeds. And that's a very different audience from a mainstream audience. So yes, I think things will change over time.
But I just wonder for brands that are inherently, whether overtly or not, trying to get their name out there and attract customers, how can they engender greater levels of trust through podcasting?
Well, many of them are doing it by trying to build on those trusted elements that I talked about, the intimacy, having hosts that build relationships over time. And, it's very different from trying to sell something. It's about trying to build a relationship. And off the back of the trust that you build with the relationship, then you can do other things. But there's no quick fix here. And, the problem is that many commercial organizations and brands want a quick fix. And podcasting is about building for the long term.
Now, Nic, podcasts have been around since 2004. How have they changed and why have they taken off in the last 5 years or so?
What's changed is fundamentally the adoption of the smartphone and the taking away of friction, just making it easier to find them, to access them, to play them. And the smartphone in combination with headphones. And then, literally in the last few years, we've had noise-cancelling headphones, a whole load of other reasons why it's really hard to listen to speech radio in certain situations. So all of that has kind of helped. Apple, of course, driving this in the early days. The default podcasting app in, I think it was 2014 or something like that, when it became default podcasting on the Apple iPhone, really helped as well. And then finally, in the last few years, the business model. So basically, there was never any money in it. You didn't get high quality. You had a lot of amateurs playing. And now, because the advertisers are coming in, because the friction in advertising has been taken away, we're starting to see, we have seen a complete explosion of high quality content. And that in turn has, encouraged more people to arrive. So it's been a virtuous circle over the last few years. Technology, audiences, higher quality content, and that growth has been going on for some time.
News podcasts in particular have skyrocketed in popularity. Why do you think this is? In addition, obviously, to the COVID pandemic, but has there been other reasons why we've seen more news podcasts?
I think it's partly just sort of taking away the friction. Again, in podcasting 1.0, there were virtually no news programs because you had to download the program. And by the time you downloaded it, you might as well turn on the radio. And the other point is there was no money in it. So there was absolutely no point for a commercial news provider to put effort into creating different kinds of content if there was no advertising and no commercial reward. And that changes really in 2017 with the Daily and New York Times, who started this very, very novel, well, it wasn't that novel, it's basically a radio documentary in one day using narrative storytelling techniques that I learned in radio many, many years ago. So some of this is just a reinvention and a repackaging of traditional radio. But it's brilliant. It's intimate. It's one story explained. It's something that you can listen to on your commute on the way in. And that just took off, became incredibly popular, really helped the New York Times build engagement with its audience, and then was just copied all over the world. So you have quite a lot of them in Australia. We have many in the UK, and they're still launching, daily news podcasts. There are many other types of news podcasts as well, but we've certainly seen an explosion. As you say, Nick, the COVID epidemic has really also popularized them. Many of them went to the top of the podcast charts. You had Norman Swan and ABC with explanatory podcasts about the pandemic, and we saw the same in many other countries around the world.
Now, while podcasting is a fast-growing medium, there's still a large proportion of people that don't listen to podcasts. What are some of the reasons people don't listen, and where are the biggest opportunities for producers to change this behaviour?
Yeah, we looked at that this year, and because, as you say, in our data, only about a third will listen to a podcast monthly. So the majority of people are not doing it. Why aren't they doing it? Firstly, they're just not interested. So, they don't have enough time, or the topics or the hosts don't interest them. Secondly, format. So that for them, the format is wrong. The podcast format doesn't provide something they can't read or watch. They just prefer that. Or the podcasts are too long, which is another reason. People just like to get at the information in a way that they can control, and sort of the linear format doesn't work for them. And then the third reason, which I think is really interesting, is sort of awareness and discovery, which has been sort of long discussed in podcast circles. So they are interested. They do like the format, but they don't necessarily know they exist, or they don't know how to find the good ones. And we found some really interesting data points here. So in the US, almost everyone knows what a podcast is. It's been around for a long time.
It's the same here in Australia.
And the same in Australia. But we find that in many European countries that actually 40, 50% of people just don't even know what a podcast is. So there's clearly a lot of work to be done still in terms of marketing, depending which country you're talking about. So, it's partly knowing what they are and knowing what the benefits are. It's also about surfacing content and recommendations, which has always been a problem because nobody really invested in it. Again, there was no money. And now you're starting to see platforms like Spotify really trying to crack that problem and make it not purely around what your friend tells you, but actually trying to surface that in a more programmatic way.
Now, one of the data points that did grab my attention was that more people from Ireland and Spain listened to a podcast in the last month than those from the US or Australia, and way more than Great Britain. What should we know about Ireland and Spain's podcast habits?
Well, I think the first thing you need to know is the limitations of surveys, which are based on recognition of the word podcast. So, people have varying views of podcasts. And one of the points about the UK, which comes out quite low, as you say, is a lot of people don't think about them as podcasts. They think about them as radio programs on demand, which they download from the BBC. So that probably undercounts the popularity of podcasts in the UK, which is pretty high. I would say on a level with Australia and the US. Well, maybe not the US.
Yeah.
And then probably in the US, we also undercount podcasts because many people are kind of watching podcast-like material on YouTube. There's a huge amount of that going on in the US. So if you include all that kind of stuff in there as well, then podcast is probably even higher there. Having said that, we're certainly seeing big growth in Spain with a lot of sort of podcast apps and innovation and money coming into it as well. And Ireland has this very strong oral culture, of course. And so that, naturally transfers to very high radio listening, very high podcast listening. And I should also say that, around the world, this is now primarily, it sort of started in the English-speaking world, in UK, US, Australia, but it's really now becoming a global phenomenon. Brazil is one of the fastest growing areas with a very vibrant podcasting scene. And again, more money coming in. It's a huge market, of course.
And another finding from the 2021 report that shocked me a little bit was that the BBC Sounds podcast app is used more in the UK than traditional platforms like Spotify, Apple or Google. Is that right?
Yeah, the BBC, as we've discussed, is huge. It's a real sort of tastemaker in the UK. 90% of people access BBC programming weekly, 80% access news weekly, and they have invested a lot in creating an app called BBC Sounds and marketing it all the time aggressively, and it aggregates a huge amount of content. They produce a lot of podcast first content now, which is going back on the radio. And I should also say that many other public broadcasters have copied them. So, created an app, in many cases called Sound, that is essentially trying to do the same. And the reason they're doing this is because it is an existential threat to public broadcasters. They don't want their audiences mediated by platforms in the same way as happened with news. They want people to come to them. They want to manage that relationship. They want to have the data. They want to be able to recommend the next piece of audio to listen to. And if they're doing that through Spotify or Apple, they don't have that level of control. So this is a complete existential threat, and many public broadcasters are thinking do we have the size and scope to actually compete with the platforms? Or do we just need to give our content away and lose that direct relationship? And, if you think about the future of public broadcasting, that's a pretty big question. So you're seeing some of them, for example, saying that you have to listen to the content first within our app, and only later will it appear in Spotify. So this idea of windowing. And then there's other publishers who are thinking, well, actually, I don't want to give away my content to Spotify. I want them to pay for it within my experience. So I think that's going to be part of the next story, actually, is how publishers think about that content. So the battle between platforms and publishers, I think, is on its way.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, the ABC Listen app came in fourth in Australia,
Right,
behind YouTube, Spotify and Apple. What would your message be to ABC Australia, if anything?
Well, it's the same problem. And I talk to people at ABC and I know that they're thinking very carefully about this. I think a lot of their content wasn't on Spotify at the beginning because they were worried about this threat. And so it's clearly a balance because ABC has a duty to get to all Australians. And so, using all the channels is obviously important. On the other hand, they do want to build experiences. They want to recommend other things to watch that are content that has been paid for publicly, and they want to get to different groups. So it's a real challenge. I mean, if you look at history, then the platforms are going to win here, that aggregation and convenience. Yeah. But on the other hand, I mean, look at what's happening with Netflix and streaming services, is that you also, those broadcasters, if they got together and put all their content together, they could compete with a Netflix in a national situation. And of course, many of them are trying to. So I think it's all to play for. I think the next few years are absolutely about that valuable content and who has the right to and access. Yeah, definitely.
And then you build in the whole paywall argument as well for some publishers that rely on that income as well. So that's a whole different argument for another day.
It is. And that's the whole model, which was so simple at the beginning, right? It was just, make content for free, don't get paid for it, distribute it anywhere. That's changing. We're getting into very different models where you're going to have sort of paid content, premium content that huge amounts of investment go into, and so there needs to be either direct reader payment or sponsorship or other forms to get it. And then there's going to continue to be a whole load of sort of free niche content where that's distributed across platforms. So this situation that we've been in is changing pretty fast.
Yeah. And as we said earlier, hopefully trust doesn't diminish while these battles are being sorted out.
That's right.
Right.
You mentioned Netflix before. It's been a huge year for news in podcasting. Netflix, even WordPress recently have made some big podcast moves. What do you think they'll need to do to make an impact on what's already an incredibly competitive industry with the likes of Spotify and Apple really hammering it out?
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy, isn't it? Sort of suddenly everyone is waking up to the power of audio, which is, for someone who started in radio and loves audio, is great. But it's also, you do worry, don't you, about the loss of trust, the loss of purity, all of those kind of things. I think Netflix, it's interesting looking at the motivations because they're different, I think. I mean, actually, the reason why Spotify are in there and Netflix are in there is not dissimilar. Both of them essentially see sort of plateauing subscriptions and are looking to enhance the bundle. So Spotify looked at this a few years ago and said, music alone isn't going to be enough. People are getting bored with their playlists. We need to add in something else. And so they went for podcasts, which was sort of the natural thing to do. Maybe less obvious with Netflix, but in a way, Netflix is about the pipeline to great television. So they make great high-end documentaries in audio, and some of the best ones then get made into television, or vice versa. You're doing these amazing television shows and you've got an audio spin-off and a real sort of enhancement and amplification of the brand because you're putting that out in audio. So I think that trend of great television programs that have audio accompaniments on the one hand, but also feeding the pipeline is really why Netflix are involved. But it's also about trying to increase the bundle of value, of exclusive value that keeps people paying $9.99 or whatever it is a month. I think some of it will grow the market because they're going to grow at the high quality end and put more money into it. I don't think they're going to be as interested in the long tail.
One of the reasons podcasting is so successful as a medium is the ability for listeners to multitask while they listen. So you mentioned before that YouTube is a popular platform. It comes up in other surveys as well. It always surprises me. Why is YouTube such a popular place for people to listen to podcasts?
I think because people are there for other reasons and they come across stuff. But I think it does depend on the country, but it depends on the content. And I mean, the other thing that we've seen recently is essentially the visualization of radio. So there are many radio stations now that essentially just broadcast live via YouTube. with cameras, or they do weekly shows. So there are a lot of comedians and other celebrities who essentially do an audio show, but they also do a video version of it, and that is distributed via. And the fact that a lot of that is celebrity-led, which is where a lot of the audience is one of the reasons why it's so popular. And then you've got the tradition of talk radio in the US in particular, which, obviously was audio originally, but now almost all of that has a YouTube version and gets clipped up and people talk about it as podcasts, or it gets turned into a weekly podcast. So that's kind of, I think it's a nightmare for researchers like me because it's very hard to know what a podcast is anymore.
It does become a definition thing, doesn't it?
Yeah. I think that's kind of what's going on. Yeah, so I think we probably need a reclassification of podcasting.
Well, that's right. I mean, is a podcast simply a podcast because it has an RSS feed?
I would say absolutely not. I mean, that's obviously where it started. And, what we're really talking about is audio on demand experiences that engage people in a regular way when they want it, in the way they want it.
So do you think podcasting would be in danger if we got rid of RSS feeds?
I don't think RSS is the defining feature anymore at all. It's trying to think about what's the core proposition from audience point of view. I mean, audience members have absolutely no idea that RSS powers a lot of this stuff. And for many publishers, it doesn't. It's just a question of accessing something they want when they want it, and they click a button.
Yeah, listeners don't care if it's RSS feed. And for brands that are publishing audio, which is predominantly our audience to this podcast, you can't ignore YouTube just because it doesn't have an RSS feed. If you have an audience that's going to listen and or watch you on YouTube, then that's where you should be publishing.
But the messaging for marketing, does it still rely on, well, podcasts are great because you can multitask, but if most people are watching or listening on YouTube, that advantage is out the window.
Except the people are multitasking on YouTube. They just basically have it on in the background. So in many cases, people are listening to the output. It's not about the visual quality of it. They're often doing other things at the same time. So they've got that laptop on, they've got a tab open, they're listening to something, and it doesn't really matter whether there's the video bit there or not.
Yeah, we're stuck in COVID lockdown again in Melbourne at the moment, and I must admit I use the ABC Facebook page to stream a lot of the daily press conferences, but my eyes are very rarely on that screen or that tab, as you said. It's just something that's on in the background. It's like having a radio on. It's just easier in my workflow to flick open the Facebook tab and have a listen.
But I wonder, is it more difficult to kind of do the cleaning or go for a run or walk the dog listening to YouTube when the interface so easily can change? Whereas when you're in the app, a podcast app, it's kind of fixed and stays there, whereas YouTube disappears if a stray button gets hit.
Yeah, you're right. This is all about context, and it depends what else you're doing. So there are some contexts where it's just audio only. And that's why I think, fundamentally this is about audio first or audio led, but not audio only. And so to me, the video is always the secondary part of a podcast. That would be one sort of definition that I might use. It's a podcast because it's fundamentally audio first. There might be video stream alongside it, but it's not designed in that way.
Finally, Nic, it's crystal ball time. And I think this question was made just for you. What do you think is the future of podcasting?
Well, I think it's just a subset of this incredibly exciting digitization of radio, this audio revolution essentially, which includes radio was kind of an amazing medium that continues to be an amazing medium, and it wasn't really affected by the internet. And now it is being affected in really interesting ways, I think. And it's everything from sort of voice activation to explosion of live audio and live streaming, which we've talked about, interactive audio, more personalized audio. And to me, podcasting is kind of one and a critical element of that. And it's, not about RSS feeds. It's about great linear content of varying lengths that builds a relationship that is intimate, that is entertaining, that gives you something you can't get elsewhere, that allows you to multitask. We've talked about that's kind of the essence. And I think what changes, so what's the future? I think it's, again, reducing the access points, the ease of reducing the friction, increasing the ease of access. So the discovery, I think, we're going to get some great new discovery interfaces, which I think is obviously one of the blockers right now. I think on the business side, we're going to see really, really high quality audio, more money coming in at the top end, and then just more explosion of sort of great niche content at the other end. And with paid models increasingly, as we've discussed, it's not just going to be about free content supported by advertising. We're going to get a much more richer set of business models that support different parts of the podcasting ecosystem. And yeah, we won't, I think the other future of podcasting is maybe in 10 years' time, we won't be talking about podcasting.
Oh, what will we be talking about?
We'll just be talking about great audio content.
There you go.
So you'll have to rename this. You can't call it Podcasting Essentials in 10 years' time.
I actually don't like the word podcasting because I think it's a bit of a catch-all for so many things. And as you just said, that's going to only increase as time goes on. So we're on the same page there, Nic.
Excellent.
Nic, it's been such an interesting conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Pleasure. That's been great.
Thanks, Nic, and keep up the great work with the survey.
Thanks. Will do.
Well, you know, I really thought Nic made some fantastic points in that interview. And it looks like the discussion around podcast definitions is going to continue.
You know, I actually care less about the precise definition or even the role of RSS in the future. I care more about the key points Nic made about us all concentrating on reducing friction to usability, increasing discoverability, and that we see higher and higher quality audio. And as Nic said, that the conversation is about great audio.
100%, Nic. But I have to say that the opportunities that stand out for me are how we educate and perhaps tweak the way that we market podcasts to grow listenership. And that's a really interesting journey that we need to take. And look, it's up to us as podcasters and producers to ensure that the high rates of trust in the medium continue and even grow.
Yeah, absolutely. And trust being so high is a pretty great starting point.
Oh, yeah.
Let's just hope that podcasting 2.0 doesn't undo the great position we're in now.
That's right.
Well, that's it for this episode of Podcasting Essentials. Thanks, Nicole, for joining me.
It's been terrific. Thank you, Nic.
For more about us and how we can help you produce a podcast, you can visit soundcartel.com.au or our socials at SoundCartelAU. From all of us at SoundCartel, thanks so much for listening.